So today we're going to continue talking about nectonic organisms. Really, here I'm kind of munging a couple of topics together. Talking about nectonic organisms, cephalopods, and sharks, and other kinds of fish, but really, this is the discussion of multicellular organisms with the conceit that those are really the only organisms that can be big enough and powerful enough to swim against currents and form parts of the nectonic community. But of course, there are multicellular organisms in the planktonic community, and there are multicellular organisms in the benthic communities. And so I'm kind of munging all those things together. Your book separates them out a little bit more carefully than I will. But this seems to be a biologically interesting way to do it. All right, so on Monday we got most of the way through a discussion of jawless fishes, the hagfish and the lampreys, and we got through a discussion of sharks, which are perhaps more familiar to you as fish, but are a little bit different from other kinds of fish in the sense that they don't have bony skeletons. They have cartilaginous skeletons. And finally, we're going to finish up by looking at the bony fish, which is the most diverse group of the fishes. There are lots of different kinds of sharks, and there are a few different kinds of hagfish and lampreys, but not nearly as many as there are kinds of bony fish, something like 30,000 species, and they're being discovered all the time. That's not the final number by any means. And bony fish are also, of course, a big economic issue. That's the bulk of the food supply that we get from the oceans is in the form of bony fish and from aquatic environments on the continents as well. And if you add all the different kinds of fish together, it's actually fairly substantial. It's something like 10, 15 kilograms of fish per person per year. The United States is a little bit under the global average. We eat lots of other kinds of meat. But nonetheless, something like 7 kilograms per person per year. So actually, what's in the ocean and our ability to harvest that fish production from the ocean is actually a significant nutritional and economic issue. I talked a little bit in the context of sharks about how they have to swim to avoid sinking. Basically, they don't have swim bladders because they don't really need them, probably. They're either living on the bottom, in which case they're perfectly happy resting on the bottom, or the free-swimming sharks tend to be predators, in which case they are moving vertically rather rapidly through the seawater, and they don't want something that's going to prevent them from changing pressure quickly. But bony fish, in particular, almost always have a significant swim bladder, particularly the nectonic bony fish. And this allows them to maintain their buoyancy to prevent themselves from sinking or floating up, so they can sit in a particular spot where they want to be in the water column without really having to expend swimming energy to stay there. So that can be a definite advantage if they're trying to conserve energy as much as possible. And that bladder can be filled up with gases in different ways. Some fish will actually go up to the surface and grab air bubbles at the surface, or since there are gases dissolved in seawater, nitrogen, oxygen, and CO2, in fact, it's possible to simply extract those gases back out of the water with the expenditure of a little bit of energy and form a gas bladder that way. Now, bony fish, they have bones, and some of them are actually somewhat armored, and therefore they can perhaps be a little safer, but of course they're still sort of meaty organisms and have to be concerned about getting eaten, and of course they also have to worry about finding food themselves. And one of the adaptations in bony fish and also to some sharks is the ability to swim very quickly or for long periods of time with a minimal expenditure of energy, so sort of maximum efficiency. And actually different kinds of fish seem to be adapted to swim in different ways. This is actually a computer model of the fluid dynamics around a salmon or trout-shaped fish, borrowed from the University of Minnesota. And this is the body of the fish. We're kind of looking down on it from above. This is where the head would be. This is where the tail is. You can see this chaotic wake, actually vortices being shed off the tail, and that's actually where the power of the fish's tail comes from. The arrows indicating flow directions go like this and go like this. They're essentially these jets in between the eddies that are directed backwards away from the fish. That's thrust. And for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the pushing of water back pushes the fish forward. Fish are also adapted to generate lots of energy when they need it by burning food. And of course, you need oxygen to do respiration. So the ability to get oxygen to the part of your body that needs that energy, to the muscles, is very important. And fish have an efficient mechanism for doing this. They have gills, whereas we have lungs where we bring air into our bodies and extract the oxygen from it with a high surface area of access to the blood. Fish actually have water flowing over a high surface area part of their circulatory system so that the oxygen can actually diffuse into the blood. And so typically when fish are swimming, water will come in through the mouth and it will pass over the gills and then leave the fish. And the oxygen is extracted. CO2 and other products from respiration are transferred into the water and then away from the fish also by the same process. And finally, fish, of course, are, at least the ones that want to swim quickly with a minimum expenditure of energy, are streamlined. Their shape has been optimized over time to minimize the amount of drag they experience as they move through the water, while still being able to generate power and push themselves forward. And so fish have fins. This is no big surprise, hopefully. And for the fast-swimming fish, typically, the most important fin for creating thrust is the tail fin, the caudal fin. And in fact, that fin is also extensively optimized to generate the maximum amount of lift in the case of fast-swimming fish that are large with a minimum amount of energy expenditure. And so there's actually a series of compromises that are made in different parameters of the fish shape and the fin shape in order to maximize that efficiency. These same principles actually turn up in large fish and in things like boats and submarines. Actually, the larger fish have similar hydrodynamic properties to things that we might write in. And in fact, that's not an accident. In fact, people who set out to design things like submarines will look at fish and other organisms swimming quickly through the ocean as models to start from. So one sort of key feature of fast-swimming fish is typically a fineness parameter of about 1 in 4, which is essentially the length of the fish divided by its diameter. Sorry, diameter divided by length. I got it backwards. And this number of around 1/4 is kind of optimal for generating minimal drag from two sources. First of all, there's the drag that comes from just water rubbing against the skin as the fish swims through the ocean. And that tends to make it more efficient to have as little skin area as possible because that's always going to be dragging the water along and creating drag that way. But of course, you also want to have sort of a minimal frontal area presented to the water that you're swimming through because the water has to be pushed out of the way for the fish to swim through it. And so there's a compromise. If you had a spherical fish, it would have minimal area to cause that kind of drag, but it would present a pretty big cross-section that tried to swim through the water, and so it would take a lot of energy just to push the water out of the way, and there would be a lot of turbulence in its wake. If you had a very long, skinny fish, well, it wouldn't present very much of a pushing out of the way drag through the water because it would be a very thin cross-section, but it would have lots of area to encapsulate the same amount of volume, and so it would be dragging a lot of water along with it along the sides. So the best compromise between those two things is something shaped sort of like a bullet or like an airplane hull or like a tuna. Find this parameter of something like 0.25. In addition, the tail of fast-swimming fish like tuna are actually best thought of as analogous to wings. They're lifting surfaces, and much like the wings on aircraft that are designed for the maximum possible efficiency for aircraft, relatively low speeds, for fish, relatively high speeds, is a high aspect ratio, a very large span. I'm sorry, it's getting cut off. This is supposed to say span, S-P-A-N. So a very large wingspan and a very narrow chord. So think of like a sailplane, which is designed, of course, to glide through the air as efficiently as possible, and it still goes relatively fast. Those have very long, skinny wings. Jetliners also tend to have relatively long, skinny wings to minimize the burning of fuel. So these two adaptations, sort of a bullet-shaped, narrow, roundish body and a broad but narrow tail, a wide-spanning but narrow tail, are characteristics of fish that want to swim at the maximum possible speed for the maximum possible amount of time with a minimal expenditure of energy. And so if you watch tuna swimming in a tank, in fact, you get a very good sense of this. So here we have tuna swimming. You can see that wide span but narrow chord of the tail, so it makes a very efficient lifting surface, very much like a sailplane, and this very streamlined bullet-shaped body. And in fact, you can see that these fish, even though they're not swimming super fast, they can swim much faster, I assure you. Sort of the extraneous appendages are being folded against the body, like the pectoral fins. They're not out like this. They're kind of folded in to minimize that drag. And tuna can swim really fast when they want to. All right, so any questions so far? Now, of course, not all fish are optimized to swim fast. Our state fish of California, the Garibaldi, which you'll very commonly find if you ever get a chance to go snorkeling or scuba diving in some place like Catalina or any of the other kelp areas off the California coast. They're very curious, so they'll come up to you. It's very common to see them. And these are fish that don't have those adaptations, right? Not really a bullet-shaped body. Doesn't really have that very wide span, narrow chord tail. It has a kind of broad tail. That's more common for fish that are ambush predators, that want to generate lots of power very quickly, but don't spend a lot of their time swimming fast. So the efficiency of swimming fast isn't their main issue. The main issue is being able to change speed very quickly to either catch their prey or get away from something that's trying to catch them. There are other adaptations as well, aside from the ability to swim fast. And of course, we've talked about color change for cephalopods, and they're really the masters of that. They can do it very quickly, and they do it in a tremendous variety of ways. But there are fish that can do a similar thing. Flatfish, which are very common in Santa Monica Bay, can, in many cases, change their coloration to match the background so that they aren't as conspicuous when viewed from above. Other types of fish that swim in the water column may also adopt camouflage to match other things in their environment, like a sargassum fish, which lives in the North Atlantic Gyre, which is kind of a desert in the ocean, but there are these floating seaweeds that do primary productivity, and they're kind of the focus of many of the ecosystem near the surface there. And these fish actually kind of drift along with the seaweed, and you might not even be able to tell that there's a fish there, but this is the eye, here's his mouth, and kind of coming back to the tail up there. And even for fish that swim just out in the open ocean, they also take advantage of coloration to sort of minimize their ability to be spotted. And in this case, hidden from. This is a great white shark. And what you can see here is a very common feature in pelagic fish, countershading, where the dorsal part of the fish, the part that faces towards the surface, is relatively dark colored. And imagine you're looking down, like you're a seal or a sea lion, you're looking down, you see the deep, dark ocean, right? And so a fish that's swimming through the deep ocean, it makes sense that he'll want to keep his backside kind of dark to blend in. However, if you're looking up from below, then you're going to be looking up at the sky or the clouds or whatever's overhead, which is generally going to be much brighter because that's where the sun is. And so it makes sense for a fish to appear much brighter from below than it does from above. And so the great white shark has this counter shading. It's light on the bottom, dark on top, and there's kind of a dappling in between to minimize the outline when it's viewed from the side. All right. So are there any remaining questions about nectonic organisms? We're going to move on to benthos. Okay. So the final lifestyle division that we're going to look at is benthos, the benthic organisms in the ocean, which essentially means organisms that either live in, on, or associated with the seafloor. And a good example of a benthic organism would be the sand dollar. We'll come back to them in a minute, but you can see them just living very happily in a pile on the sandy bottom with some seaweed. And the benthic community is actually reasonably complex, and of course it's going to depend in the life habits on what the seafloor is actually like. There are organisms that actually live inside the sediment or inside the seafloor for most of their lives. These can be burrowing organisms or boring organisms in the case of things like bivalves that live in rocky shorelines. They may actually be able to bore into the rock and make a burrow that way. And a good example for a sandy shore environment would be a razor clam, or in this case a jackknife clam. Razor clams, I think, are Pacific, and jackknife clams are Atlantic, but they have very similar habits of life. And Like many bivalve mollusks, it lives most of its life burrowed down into the sediment, kind of anchored, and then it extends a feeding appendage up above the surface to get food, but it's inconspicuous, and of course if something comes along that it thinks is going to eat it, it'll just pull the feeding appendage down and close up and be hidden below the sediment surface. If you pull one out, or if one decides to pop out onto the surface, it looks a lot like a clam. In fact, clams also tend to burrow. So that would be an infaunal lifestyle, an organism that actually burrows or bores down into the surface of the seafloor. And of course, there are organisms that just kind of crawl across the seafloor or anchor themselves to the seafloor without actually burrowing into it. And good examples of that kind of behavior would be a sea anemone or a sea urchin. Both of these are nominally mobile organisms. They can crawl along the seafloor if they choose to, but they tend to do so relatively slowly, and they don't really swim in the free water column very often. I think there actually is a kind of sea anemone that can swim, but it's unusual. And then the final group we'll talk about are organisms that can swim freely. In some cases, they can swim quite strongly, but they're associated with these seafloor communities and may actually spend some of their time either resting or burrowing into the seafloor. And a good example of that would be our friend the horned shark, which is fairly common, again, in kelp communities in Southern California. This is a picture actually taken off the coast of San Diego. And clearly, this is a fish that can swim. It has strong tail muscles and all that stuff, but he's just sitting there on the seafloor. And in fact, he spends most of his time there. His food is things like clams. So he's, of course, interested in trying to hang out on the seafloor where his food lives. So we can divide up organisms according to sort of where they live on the seafloor. Does it burrow into the seafloor? Then it's infauna. Does it rest on top of the seafloor? Then it's epifauna. Does it sort of sometimes rest but sometimes swim or swim near the seafloor? Then it's nectobenthic. We can also divvy up these organisms associated with the seafloor according to their mode of nutrition. And this actually is particularly interesting for benthic organisms because that's one place in the ocean where you can kind of attach yourself. You can either seek out your food or you can wait for your food to come to you as the current wafts across the seafloor. If you're a planktonic organism, it's a little harder to wait for your food to come to you because you're drifting along with it. So in terms of life habit, there are going to be autotrophs in benthic communities if you're in a neritic environment where sunlight penetrates to the seafloor. And kelp would be an outstanding example of such an ecosystem. We'll talk about another one later. Many of these organisms are algae living in the photic zone, but attaching themselves to the seafloor and forming large organisms like kelp. We'll also talk about the coral reef community either today or Monday, which is a little bit more complicated because it's actually autotrophy inside of an animal, photosynthesis occurring inside of an animal. And then there are, of course, heterotrophs, which have to get their food from some other organism. And the strategies are quite varied for benthic organisms in particular. Many of these strategies also occur in the nekton and in the plankton, but it's kind of colorful to talk about them in the context of the benthic community. And we're going to divvy up for the purposes of this class into 4-ish divisions. I think your book actually lumps suspension and filter feeders together. The distinction I'll make in the lecture, which you really won't need to know for your final, is just that suspension feeders are passive. This would be a good picture of a suspension feeder, a crinoid, kind of just holding up these appendages and waiting for food to drift by and get stuck, and then it'll eat it. Filter feeders actually, at least as I've learned it, they actually generate their own currents. They'll actually push water through their feeding appendage. So they'll generate a current, force water through something that can strain out the food, and then push the leftover water back out again. There are deposit feeders, which will go through detritus, through the sediment, looking for food. And there are active herbivores that actually will crawl on the surface grazing of algae or whatever their food source is. And there are active carnivores that are, of course, hunting out other heterotrophs. So we'll go through these in turn and give you a few examples. So suspension and filter feeders, these are the organisms that essentially strain their food out of seawater, and they tend to eat small things. And good examples would be sponges, some of the most primitive multicellular animals on the planet. And these are actually really interesting the way they make their living. They have many individual cells that kind of have flagella, so they make little currents on the cellular scale. And those flagella are typically oriented in such a way that water is drawn in. And then they have chimney structures, which you can see the outlets to here, where that water, after it's been strained through the organism, is pushed back out again. So you can think of a sponge as being like a giant chimney with individual organisms living inside that sponge, kind of cooperating to make these currents that bring food to them. And there are corals, which get some of their actually a lot of their nutrition in the case of reef-building corals from photosynthesis directly, but also are suspension feeders. They send out tentacles when they're active, just waiting for something to fall into that tentacle, and then of course they bring it in and digest it. Deposit feeders, again, like sand dollars, are organisms that get their food out of the sediment in some way. In the case of sand dollars, these are soft sediment organisms. They live on sandy or muddy shorelines typically, and they kind of just crawl along through the sediment on the surface or just underneath the sediment surface, looking for little bits of food, which when they find them, they then eat them and then keep going. So you can think of them as being like the oceanic equivalent, perhaps, of an earthworm, which burrows through the soil looking for vegetative material that it can eat. And active herbivores, good examples would be sea urchins. In the case of the purple sea urchin, which I think is what's the picture here, they crawl along looking for bits of kelp to eat, and then we'll eat the kelp, just like a cow grazing across the savanna. And this is actually a land animal. This is a snail, but many marine snails are also active herbivores. And I like this picture because you can actually see the grazing. So you can see how this, I think it's a wall actually, has some algae that's grown on it because it's fairly damp, and you can see the snail crawling along, and you can actually see the little grazing marks where he's eaten off the algae as he crawls along. So it's a little hard to think of the snail as being an active anything, but they actually are active herbivores in many cases. And we're going to see in a minute an even more active snail. The final group that we'll talk about are the active carnivores. These are animals, heterotrophs, that actually seek out other animals to eat more or less actively. And of course, many of the fish we've talked about, many of the sharks we've talked about, we've already seen a video of a cuttlefish acting as an active carnivore, as a predator in a little fish tank where it was chasing down a fish. I thought it would be interesting to show something you might not have thought of as an active carnivore. This is a snail, cone snail, and they're pretty well known because, in part, they have these really beautiful shells. They're actually collector's items. A little bit of an issue of concern because people go out and take all the snails to keep the shells, and snails aren't really very happy without their shells. It's also a little bit notorious because some of these snails are actually rather dangerous. They have really pretty shells. People will pick them up and look at them and be very unpleasantly surprised when they get harpooned by the snail that lives inside the shell, and the harpoon has relatively powerful poison in it that, in fact, can make your day really bad really quickly. And that harpoon and that poison is not there just to keep people from picking them up. It's actually how they hunt. And there are cone snails that are essentially surface carnivores. They crawl along the surface looking for some prey to catch. And there are ambush predators that actually hide underneath the surface and wait for something to get close enough to catch. And so I found a YouTube video of an aquarium again where we have a burrowing cone snail that's trying to find some food. And so just to get you oriented, this is sediment inside the aquarium. This is just the probe with the harpoon of the cone snail. The rest of it's buried. All right. And you can see the fish on the extreme left now, just kind of sitting there, not quite sure what's going on. So the poison is very powerful. The fish essentially is paralyzed within a few seconds. And then, yeah, right down the hatch. So there's actually been some interest in understanding how the poison of these things works. It's a very powerful paralyzing agent. It works incredibly fast. And you can imagine why it has to be so. I mean, the snail can't exactly run away very quickly. If the fish is struggling, that's really not very good for the snail. All right. Any questions about modes of nutrition? All right. So to finish up the hour, I'll go through a couple of particularly interesting benthic ecosystems. There's no way I can talk about all of the interesting ones. For instance, it would be really neat to talk about mangroves, which are kind of a benthic ecosystem. They're actually a fairly rich ecosystem that includes benthic organisms. But we'll talk about kelp forests because, of course, we're in California, and kelp is fairly common in California. And then we'll, if we get a chance at the end of the hour, talk a little bit about coral reefs. And we may come back to that later, and also I think we'll show the coral reefs episode of The Blue Planet next week as the extra credit video. So the basic idea of the kelp forest ecosystem is that this is, unlike the plankton-based ecosystems we've talked about in the oceanic realm, this is really a benthic photosynthesis-based ecosystem where the primary productivity is largely being accomplished by kelp, which are a form of seaweed. They're sometimes called, I think, red or brown algae, depending on what kind you're talking about. And no, it's only one or the other, but I've forgotten which, but that's okay. I won't hold you to it on the final. And these organisms live attached to the bottom and grow up into the light. And so this can only happen, of course, if seawater is relatively shallow, where the sunlight that penetrates the seafloor is intense enough for the kelp to do its photosynthesis. And these kelp forests are actually fairly broadly distributed around the planet. Of course, in Southern California, we have lots of kelp. And in fact, kelp ecosystems run all the way up to the coast of Alaska. They're common in South America. They're common on the southwest coast of Africa, southern Australia, many parts of the world, Japan, northern Japan at least. And you can hopefully see here that there's a little bit of a antipathetic relationship between where kelp forests, the blue Ks, occur, and where coral reefs, the red Rs, occur. What's the systematic there? Where do you tend to find the kelp? That's where you tend to find the reefs. That's where the red Rs are. Where are the blue Ks? Fairly cold water, that's right. Not super cold, but sort of temperate to cooler waters. And particularly along west coasts. So kelp forests are fairly well associated with eastern boundary currents. And of course, what do we know about eastern boundary currents? They typically are locations of upwelling. So these tend to be relatively nutrient-rich waters that the kelp like to live in. In the case of the California kelp forest ecosystem, there is a particularly important ecological relationship between the primary producers, the kelp, which are consumed by many organisms, but important among them are sea urchins, in particular purple sea urchins, like the picture I showed you, which themselves form food for a predator, the sea otter. And of course, this isn't the entirety of the ecosystem. There are other things that eat kelp. There are other things that eat sea urchins, and there are certainly things that eat sea otters. They're at the top of the food chain. But this particular part of the food chain turns out to be rather critical to the ecosystem as a whole. And the basic issue is that otters eat sea urchins and thus help keep their numbers under control. This is actually a picture of an otter in the process of eating a purple sea urchin. It's got to get it open first, I presume. So the otter basically, even though it's a relatively rare organism in these environments, okay, remember that when you go from plankton to primary consumers to secondary consumers in the open ocean, the amount of biomass and the numbers of organisms drops very quickly, orders of magnitude, factors of 10 or 100 or more. The same is true for these benthic ecosystems commonly, that the bottom of the food chain makes up most of the mass and most of the numbers, and as you get farther up the food chain, talking about fewer and fewer organisms, there aren't tremendous numbers of otters compared to the mass of kelp in a kelp forest ecosystem, but they turn out to be relatively important. Unfortunately, they're also important, at least historically, for human economy, in particular because their fur is very high quality, it's very warm, it's water resistant, and so it was really valuable, and much of the Pacific Northwest was in fact originally explored in the context of looking for fur from organisms like sea otters and fur seals and other marine mammals. Well, unfortunately, these are fairly high up in the food chain, So there aren't very many of them, so it doesn't actually take that much effort to kind of destabilize that part of the food chain, to remove so many sea otters from the environment that their ecological role doesn't really function anymore. And what happens? Well, they eat the sea urchins. So if you take the otters out of the ecosystem, the sea urchins don't really have as many predators anymore, and so they tend to expand their numbers. Well, what happens then? Sea urchins eat kelp. There's nothing to eat the sea urchins. The sea urchins grow in numbers. The kelp starts to get eaten much more quickly than it did before, and then that, in fact, can destabilize the whole system, because if you actually eat too much of the kelp and that kelp forest collapses, well, then there's no food for the sea urchins anymore, so the sea urchins become less common. And then if you try to put the sea otters back, they don't have their food anymore, and so they're not going to hang around. So it's like if you take the keystone out of an arch. That's what keeps the arch from collapsing on itself. You pull out the keystone, the arch collapses. If you put the keystone back and let it go, it's not going to put the arch back into place. In fact, the keystone will just fall back down. The structure of the ecosystem kind of depends on one or a few organisms in the ecosystem. And if you disturb that little part of the ecosystem, in fact, a much broader part of it will experience a perturbation. And so in the case of the kelp forest ecosystem, we can think of the otter as something like a keystone species. It's not a major component in the ecosystem in terms of numbers, in terms of biomass, but it turns out to be really important because of the way its behavior impacts the other parts of the ecosystem. So in the case of otters, their behavior keeps sea urchins under control in terms of numbers, which allows the kelp themselves to thrive. So it's turning out to be relatively difficult to bring back kelp forests in places where they collapsed because the sea urchin was removed, where the otters were removed. However, they are making somewhat of a comeback in California in particular. Perhaps not so much the case in Alaska, but it's not clear what's going on there that controls their numbers. But there have been issues of declining marine mammal numbers in the Alaskan coast, actually, that are a little bit enigmatic even today. All right, any questions about kelp forests? All right, so to finish out the hour, talk a little bit about coral reefs as another example of a benthic community, and a really interesting example of a benthic community. It's kind of unique in the oceans in a lot of ways. So kelp forest ecosystems, like most coastal ecosystems, are relatively productive. They have access to nutrients that are washing off the land. They have access to upwelled nutrients, at least if they're along the west coasts and parts of eastern boundary currents. Coral reefs are also very productive regions of the ocean, but they can be very productive even when they aren't close to a source of nutrients. In fact, they aren't even happy if they're close to a source of nutrients. They tend to occur in relatively warm tropical parts of the ocean. They're very diverse, but the water itself is relatively nutrient poor. Warm parts of the ocean, or parts of the ocean in general, where there's a strong stratification in density from the surface where sunlight can penetrate to the deep water where the nutrients are. So it's very difficult to bring those nutrients up to the surface. You have to push them through less dense water, and that takes lots of energy. So in general, coral reefs occupy parts of the ocean where there aren't a lot of nutrients near the surface. And they've actually adapted themselves to get around that problem. Right at the equator itself, of course, there are nutrients because of equatorial upwelling, but nonetheless, the water there tends also to be cold. There are coral reefs very close to the equator, but you might expect that in a very strongly upwelling part of the equatorial ocean, the coral reefs aren't going to be that happy. These are environments, they have some phytoplankton, but not as much as you might expect based on the productivity. And of course, because there's not much phytoplankton, low nutrients, warm water, these are kind of the perfect place to put a resort, perfect place to have tourism. Of course, there's a little bit of a conflict there because whenever there are people, there are things like lawns and sewage treatment plants which tend to put nutrients out into the local ocean, which is not good for the coral reefs, but is good for the phytoplankton, which cause the water not to be as nice to swim in, which reduces the desirability of that particular location as a resort. So there's a little bit of a bad feedback. But nonetheless, these are parts of the world where people really like to visit. So what's the basis of this ecosystem? Well, it turns out to actually be these coral, which I've just talked to you about in the context of their feeding strategy. They are suspension feeders, right? And yet they're the base of this ecosystem somehow. which doesn't have very much phytoplankton in it. So corals are colonial organisms. One large coral, like you might see in this picture, you might say, oh, that's one coral organism, is actually a colony of many organisms living together. So if you look at a close-up, in this case of a staghorn coral, at sort of the millimeter scale, you can actually see the individual organisms living in this coral. And again, you can see that they're suspension feeders. You can see that there's a little body here and little tentacles that are coming out to catch food. But that's actually not where they get most of their food, at least not the reef-building corals. If we look a little closely at their anatomy, this is a drawing from NOAA. They're fairly simple organisms. They're actually a lot like jellyfish in their anatomy. They have tentacles, which they use to catch food and then kind of bring it to a mouth where the digestion happens. Of course, corals are different from jellyfish in that they make the coral rock. They secrete a calcium carbonate cup for themselves to live in. At least the reef-building corals do. Some corals actually are soft. They don't make calcium carbonate, but many do. And so they actually make a little sort of protective shell for themselves to live in, and they can, in many cases, contract themselves when they're not feeding to avoid getting eaten or scraped off. The critical thing, though, is that not only do they have tentacles to catch food, but the reef-building corals actually have a symbiotic relationship with photosynthesizing organisms. If you look at a reef-building coral, you can actually see the color, right? And color indicates the presence of a pigment, and this is a green pigment, at least kind of greenish-brown, which suggests the presence of chlorophyll. This coral actually has a number of symbiotic photosynthesizers living inside of its body. And these photosynthesizing organisms are called zooxanthellae, and they're critical to the health of a coral reef ecosystem, because that's really where most of the primary production is occurring, inside of these animals, inside of these suspension feeders that live attached to the seafloor. And so what does the coral get from this relationship? But of course, it gets a source of food. In fact, something like 90% of its food might come from these symbiotic photosynthesizers. What do the photosynthesizers get is a little bit perhaps less obvious. But remember, these are warm water, clear water environments. There's not a lot of nutrition in the open ocean here. And so if these organisms were going to try to make their living in the free water, they would actually have a pretty hard time of it. There's not much for them to do their photosynthesis with. However, living inside of another organism, there's the possibility to concentrate nutrients for relatively large periods of time. And of course, these are animals, the corals that are hosting them, so they're actually digesting and respiring material, liberating some of the nutrients, and presumably making those nutrients available for the photosynthesizing algae to take advantage of. So it's like a little compost cycle inside of each coral organism. And it really is. This is where most of the energy to drive the coral reef ecosystem comes from. Animal photosynthesis. So the primary productivity in coral reefs, like in kelp, is actually benthic. It's occurring in organisms attached to the seafloor. And in the case of the coral reef, it's organisms inside of animals. And thus, corals actually do really well when there's not very much nutrition in the open water, because that reduces their competition. Coral reefs, one way you can destabilize and kill a coral reef, in fact, is by putting too much nutrition into the environment. That allows other kinds of photosynthesizing organisms, in particular algae, to grow really fast. And they can actually outcompete the coral, grow over them, and kill them if there's too many nutrients in the environment. Interesting. Sorry, there was a slide that was supposed to be here that's missing, but that's okay. So these photosynthesizing organisms hosted inside the coral organism are basically their requirements are the requirement for the ecosystem as a whole. They require plenty of sunlight, they require clear water, and they really can only do well in fairly warm conditions. So they need water temperatures of order 20 degrees Celsius or more. And this adaptation allows coral reefs to really dominate those kinds of environments where there aren't very many nutrients, where other organisms can't make do. And so if we look at the distribution of coral, which we already saw in the picture with kelp, but this is just another picture from NASA, they're strongly correlated with locations near the equator, and in fact, almost to a 1 fall within the region of the ocean where the surface temperature on average is 20 degrees Celsius or more, which is what's indicated in blue on the map below. So places like Indonesia, northeastern Australia, east coast of Africa, the Caribbean are great places to find coral reefs. What's going on here? Why aren't there coral reefs off the coast of Angola and Namibia? Does anybody have an idea? Sorry? That's good, yeah. So presumably what's happening here is this is part of an eastern boundary current, right? We have a current coming up this way as part of the South Atlantic gyre, bringing cold water with it. So the average surface temperature is less than 20 degrees. And that's cold, which the coral presumably doesn't like. And because the water is cold, there's the opportunity to upwell lots of nutrients, which are going to allow algae and other organisms to outcompete the coral. So the west coast of Africa is cold and relatively nutrient rich, and so there really aren't very many coral reefs there. That's right. Same goes for the west coast of North America, which is also a place where there are relatively few coral reefs compared to the east coast. Okay. So another important thing about coral reefs, we're talking about photosynthesizing organisms, single-celled organisms living inside coral, right, which are themselves pretty small, a millimeter or so in size, or a centimeter maybe, right? But these organisms collectively can actually change the shape of the planet. And they do so by essentially this process of depositing the cup in which the individual corals live. And those build up over time. The corals move upwards towards the sunlight to do photosynthesis and abandon their old cups, or those die or get broken or turn into rubble in a storm. And over time, you actually build up a limestone edifice from all these old shells. So it's an example of a biogenous sediment, in this case in relatively shallow water, but it can build up at tremendous rates and tremendous masses because there are so many coral organisms in these really productive environments. So over time, you actually can build up a time sequence of individual organisms, and on a broader scale, you can actually build up a new kind of margin where the land meets the ocean, where the corals are growing up close to the ocean surface. They can't survive in the air, so they can't grow above sort of the low tide line, but they'll get as close as they can, and they'll grow outwards as long as the water is relatively warm and relatively clear and low nutrient. See, so over time, all of these individual skeletons actually build up a deposit which can change the shape of the margin. And in fact, it can change the shape of an entire island. For instance, let's take the case of a volcano like Hawaii. I'll show you an example from the Galapagos in a minute. Okay, so you build up volcanic deposits of basalt usually, and of course the waves are going to be eroding it away, but it's a hard spot that's pretty close to the ocean surface along the shoreline of this volcano, and if it's in sufficiently warm water, coral organisms are going to start to colonize it, and you'll make an initial coral reef. Now, it may occur in an active volcano that coral reef gets buried by new volcanic eruptions. That happens in Hawaii actually fairly frequently on the Big Island. But over time, eventually, the volcano, if it's a hotspot volcano, will move off the hotspot. It will stop erupting, and then the corals can grow without being buried. And in addition, as that volcano moves off the hotspot, it's cooling down, and the oceanic crust and lithosphere underneath it is cooling down as that ages. And so you would expect that the island starts to sink, gets deeper. And of course, the top of it's going to get leveled off by waves eventually as well, which have lots of erosional energy. And so what tends to happen is that the bedrock, the volcano, sinks and gets eroded away. But the coral is growing up to the surface. And in general, it can actually outcompete the rate of sinking of the volcanic bedrock. And so over time, what happens is the volcano eventually disappears, sinks, and the coral reef essentially becomes the entire island. And of course, as you build up more and more coral reef, that's adding more mass, which is going to tend to push down everything underneath it as well. So you can start out with a volcanic island, and then tens of millions of years later, all evidence that there was ever a volcano there is basically gone from the surface. You would have to do a drill core or some kind of geophysical survey to actually figure out that there was a volcano there. All you see is this big ring of coral reef around a cavity where the volcano used to be. And you can see this almost, actually even more dramatically than in a cartoon by looking at images taken from space. So this is the Galapagos Islands, which are actively volcanic today. You can see volcanic craters. It's relatively cold because it's very close to the equator, but you could imagine if it was warm enough, there would be coral reefs growing there. A few million years after the volcanoes stop erupting in a place like Tahiti and Bora Bora, you can still see volcanoes. They're eroded away and they're covered with vegetation. And you can see this coral reef that's starting to ring around the outside, growing up as the volcano starts to sink down and get eroded away. And then finally, in places like Mururoa, also in Polynesia, you can see a reef. There's a coral edifice here, and there's actually sand that's pushed up above sea level, so there's still an island. But the volcano itself, which presumably originally formed the core of this island, is nowhere to be seen. It's all coral at the surface now. And these can be huge, tens of kilometers across, built up by individual millimeter-sized organisms, one by one, a few centimeters per year perhaps, eventually making a big, tens of kilometers across island where the volcano would have long since disappeared beneath the waves. All right, so we'll finish there. Everybody have a good Thanksgiving. Come back on Monday. We'll talk a little bit about coral reef diseases and start talking about fisheries.